2 states, one man whose crimes left a trail of fear from North Carolina to South Carolina.
See misdemeanor state.
10-4 Safety officer.
This is the story of Mikal Deen Mahdi, the drifter who outsmarted police until the evidence told a story he couldn't escape. You're watching All True Crime Network, where every case hides a truth waiting to be uncovered. July 2004. A decorated police captain is ambushed outside his own home in Orangeburg, South Carolina, shot 9 times before his body is set ablaze. Just days earlier, across state lines in North Carolina, a young store clerk had already fallen victim to the same ruthless hand. The killer's name? Mikal Deen Mahdi. At just 21 years old, Mahdi's descent from petty crime into a trail of violence shocked 2 states and horrified the nation. But how did this drifter transform into a cold-blooded murderer? And why, 2 decades later, did he choose one of the most controversial forms of execution still allowed in America? The firing squad? This is the story of Mikal Deen Mahdi. Betrayal, brutality, and a chilling final choice. Before the headlines, before the manhunt, there were 2 men. Christopher Jason Boggs was just 29 years old, working the late shift at a gas station in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Friends and family called him soft-spoken, dependable, the kind of young man who never turned down a chance to help. That July night in 2004, he was simply doing his job, checking an ID, when his life was stolen in an instant. 3 days later in Orangeburg, South Carolina, tragedy struck again. Captain James Edward Jim Myers was 52 years old, a decorated officer with public safety, a husband, a father, and a mentor to his community. After decades of service, he was ambushed at home, shot 9 times and left in a fire meant to erase the evidence. 2 men from different walks of life. One, a quiet store clerk just beginning to build his future. The other, a respected veteran officer who had spent his life protecting others. Their paths would never have crossed, except through the violence of Mikal Deen Mahdi. But who was Mikal Deen Mahdi? Mikal Deen Mahdi's story begins long before that bloody summer of 2004. Born on March 20th, 1983, he grew up moving between Florida and South Carolina, raised in an environment marked by instability and fractured family ties. His parents struggled to keep him on track, but the influences around him often pulled in the opposite direction. As a teenager, Mahdi drifted toward the streets. Petty thefts, arrests, brushes with the law. It became a familiar cycle. He never finished high school, and without structure or steady guidance, crime quickly filled the void. Drugs and gang culture offered the sense of belonging that home could not. Those close to him described his temper as explosive, unpredictable, one moment calm, the next ready to lash out without warning. The environment around him only fueled the spiral. Drugs, gangs, and street culture were always within reach, but environment and upbringing only tell part of the story. Many face poverty, many grow up without stable homes, yet they choose different paths. Mahdi's volatility, his explosive temper, and his decisions ultimately set him apart. In the end, his life of crime was shaped by neglect, hardship, and environment, but it was also a choice that would leave 2 innocent men dead, and his own name etched in the dark record of violent crime. Mikal Deen Mahdi has no personal connection to the men he killed. No vendetta, no grudge. His victims were strangers, ordinary people caught in the path of a storm waiting to explode. July 15th, 2004, Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Just after midnight, a quiet Exxon gas station on Patterson Avenue became the scene of sudden horror. 29-year-old clerk Christopher Jason Boggs was behind the counter, working his night shift. A young man walked in, handed over an ID for beer. Boggs did what any clerk would do. He checked it. In that moment, Mikal Deen Mahdi pulled a .380 pistol and shot Boggs in the face. The young clerk collapsed instantly, but Mahdi wasn't finished. As Boggs lay helpless on the floor, he was shot again. The killer took nothing but a single can of beer, before slipping back into the night. 3 days later, the violence escalated. Orangeburg, South Carolina. Captain James Edward Jim Myers, a decorated officer, was at home when Mahdi arrived. Lured outside, Myers was met with a hail of gunfire. 8, 9 shots in rapid succession. The ambush was execution style, but Mahdi took his brutality even further. He dragged Myers' body into a shed and set it ablaze, as if trying to erase the evidence of the crime. 2 murders, 2 states, in just 3 days. And now, a killer on the run. How could investigators track a man who moved like a shadow across state lines, leaving only fire and blood in his wake? The investigation began with shockwaves across 2 states. In Winston-Salem, police arrived at the Exxon station to find Christopher Boggs dead behind the counter. Shell casings littered the floor, and grainy surveillance footage showed a young man entering calmly, then fleeing with nothing but a can of beer. Detectives knew this was no ordinary robbery. Meanwhile, in Orangeburg, investigators were piecing together the brutal slaying of John Myers. Captain Jim Myers, a respected officer, had been ambushed outside his own home. His body was found burned inside a shed, riddled with bullets. The violence was shocking, even to seasoned law enforcement. At first, the crime seemed isolated, but forensics told a different story. Shell casings matched. The same gun had crossed state lines, leaving a trail of blood in its wake. Eyewitness tips poured in. A stolen car traced back to the suspect tied both cases together. The name that kept surfacing, Mikal Deen Mahdi. Then came July 2002. In Richmond, police were running an undercover narcotics sting. Officer Daniel Tessier was working the case, posing as a buyer. Mahdi, already wanted for drug trafficking and robbery, was the target. The plan was simple: catch him in the act. But when officers closed in, Mahdi drew a gun. Shots rang out. Officer Tessier was struck multiple times and killed instantly. What followed was chaos. Mahdi fled, sparking a relentless manhunt. But this time, law enforcement had the upper hand. His face, his name, his location, already under surveillance. Witnesses and undercover officers identified him immediately. Within hours, police units were on the hunt. The chase spanned cities, then states. And just days later, hundreds of miles away in Miami, Florida, the fugitive was cornered. In a dramatic takedown, Mahdi was arrested, ending one of the most urgent and coordinated manhunts in recent memory. It was a victory of persistence, precision, and multi-state coordination. A moment where law enforcement proved they would not rest until justice was served. 2006, Orangeburg, South Carolina. The trial of Mikal Deen Mahdi began under intense public scrutiny. Prosecutors laid out their case with chilling precision. Mahdi had lured Captain Jim Myers outside his home, executed him in a hail of bullets, and then tried to erase the crime by setting his body on fire. To them, this was calculated, cold-blooded murder of a law enforcement officer. The defense countered with a different picture, painting Mahdi as a product of a chaotic upbringing, scarred by instability and mental struggles. But the jury was unmoved. After days of testimony, they returned a verdict: guilty. The sentence: death. 5 years later, in 2011, Mahdi stood in another courtroom, this time in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Facing the family of Christopher Boggs, he pleaded guilty to murder. The outcome: life in prison without the possibility of parole. 2 trials, 2 states, 2 grieving families, and 1 man whose violent choices left a trail of devastation. The courtroom echoed with grief, but also with finality. The name Mikal Deen Mahdi would forever be tied to tragedy. Nearly 20 years after his rampage, the sentence was finally carried out. April 11, 2025, inside South Carolina's Broad River Correctional Institution, Mikal Deen Mahdi faced the ultimate punishment. Given the choice of lethal injection, the electric chair, or firing squad, Mahdi chose the firing squad. Hours before, he was served his final meal: ribeye steak, mushroom risotto, broccoli, collard greens, a slice of cheesecake, and sweet tea to wash it down. When the moment came, he offered no last words. Mahdi remained silent. At 6:05 p.m., 5 rifles fired. But what was meant to be swift turned into controversy. An autopsy later revealed that none of the bullets struck his heart. Instead, he lingered, suffering for up to a full minute before death. His lawyers would call it cruel, even unconstitutional, a botched execution. For the families of Christopher Boggs and Captain Jim Myers, the day brought mixed emotions. Some found a measure of relief in knowing justice had been served. Others felt old wounds torn open, the pain of their loss brought sharply back to life. One man's choices had ended 2 lives in 2004. And in 2025, the state of South Carolina closed the chapter on Mikal Deen Mahdi. by the very means he chose for himself. 2 men dead, families shattered, and a justice system left questioning its own methods. For some, the execution of Mikal Deen Mahdi closed a dark and painful chapter. For others, it reopened wounds, raising unsettling questions about how we punish and what it means when justice itself inflicts suffering. In the end, Mahdi's story is not just about violence and punishment, it's about the lives he destroyed and the shadows that linger long after the final shot was fired. You've been watching All True Crime Network. If this story moved you, subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you gripping true crime cases every week. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious.